we're wrestling with a bit of internet. I think aftershocks from the collapse of the carrier earlier in the week. This is Ian Williams, President of the Foreign Press Association here in New York. And we're joined today by Paz y Miño and Stephen Donziger, who is a bit constrained, so he can't wave his ankle cuff at us to show us at the moment, but we'll try and arrange it later. So we want graphic shots. So Paz y Miño is from Amazon. Remind me, Amazon Now, Amazon Watch, which is not a cheap timepiece from a well-known mail order company. It is looking at the Amazon. And for those of you who have forgotten, because everyone immediately says Brazil, the Amazon goes way up into the Andes on the left of that picture, and Ecuador covers quite a lot of it. And it's the rainforest, remember, Ecuador on the equator. So Paul is going to explain to us exactly what happened, what the case was about, where the oil was, who had it, etc. And then we're going to speak to our pet prisoner, Stephen, who is under house arrest there. Have you got any bars you can hold for effect, Stephen? No, we should do these things properly. He's serving a 500-day house arrest sentence under the RICO statutes, racketeering and corrupt organizations, and is being held there because of Chevron's lawyers have been chasing him around the world and managed to get contempt of court indictment against him in New York, where it seems that half the judiciary in the Southern District are card-carrying members of the Federalist Society, which should carry on the back, thanks to the oil companies and all the others who finance our neoliberal expertise. So anyway, I'm editorializing here, but I think some editorializing is sometimes called for. The real bit is that a lawyer should be locked up for representing their clients in a way that an oil company deems unsuitable, which is the crucial issue we have here, plus our natural concern for indigenous inhabitants of the Amazon, whose homelands are getting polluted by people extracting oil. We know this because they tried to do it up in the Catskills when they were fracking recently, and we managed to fight them off. In the Amazon, they didn't. So Paul, please explain what happened, how it happened, what the background is to Ecuador Oil and Chevron.
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to. So I'm Paz y Miño. I'm the Associate Director at Amazon Watch. We're a 25-year-old organization that works in solidarity with indigenous peoples across the Amazon basin to protect and defend the rainforest and their rights, from resource extraction, oil drilling, dams, industrial development, agriculture, whatever the threats may be to local communities and to the rainforest itself. And so for the last 20 plus years, Amazon Watch has been involved in the campaign to get Chevron to clean up Ecuador. What happened is a legacy of destruction that has been replicated, unfortunately, throughout the Amazon. And what's important to remember is that Texaco, when Chevron was just Texaco, because they merged, was the very first oil company to drill for oil in the Amazon. So in the 1960s, Texaco went to Ecuador, signed a concession with the government, and began drilling for oil. And they set the precedent of drilling and dumping and destroying the lives of local communities that has been going on ever since. From 1964 to 1992, while operating there as the sole operator, Texaco willfully, deliberately dumped at least 16 billion gallons of toxic oil waste, the foundation waters that are extracted before crude is extracted for drilling, which by law in the United States and elsewhere should have been put into storage tanks and then re-injected into the earth. But because they knew they could get away with it, the local government wasn't going to stop them, and they considered the lives of the indigenous peoples who lived there and others disposable. They made the calculated decision to save an approximate $3 a barrel by dumping this waste. And I say 16 billion because that's what the company has admitted to deliberately dumping. It's probably many, many times more than that over the course of decades. They left behind almost 1,000 waste pits of this toxic foundation water with a system of gooseneck pipes so that it would drain into the local waterways, systematically poisoning the communities who live there. 30,000 people in the estimated area that is the size of Manhattan, which remains to this day poisoning the local communities. In the 1990s, Texaco left. It signed a corrupt agreement with the government of Ecuador, a $40 million sham remediation agreement. It pushed dirt over a portion of those pits, and then the indigenous communities, along with others, and support from Stephen, who we'll hear from, launched a class action lawsuit in New York to get Texaco to actually clean up what it had left behind. During that time, the government of Ecuador took control of the oil fields. They took control of a system that had already been designed to pollute, and they managed to continue polluting and over time upgraded that system so that it would re-inject. But there continues to be problems with Petroecuador and the Ecuadorian oil companies that operated there. They are not free from liability for their portion, but it doesn't, of course, absolve Texaco for its portion. So what began in 1992 is an unbelievably epic legal battle to get Texaco to take responsibility for the crime that it had already admitted to deliberately creating in the Amazon. And the reason that we are talking today is because Texaco, later Chevron, decided that it would do anything other than actually pay to clean up what it had admitted to creating. And that meant fighting legally, as they say, till hell freezes over, and then fight it out on the ice in every and any court that they could. It meant targeting lawyers, activists like Amazon Watch, journalists and shareholders, and anyone who would press them to actually clean up. And it's led all the way to the point of absurdity where you have, as you mentioned, Stephen Donziger now, he's been in home detention for over 600 days, actually, on a petty misdemeanor charge for which he has been accused in federal court of contempt of court. And the long-term strategy, as Chevron, as we know from Chevron's internal emails, has been to demonize Stephen Donziger, and that's what this is about today. So jumping back to 1993, it's important to understand the legal issues that went on here so that we can see why Stephen's in this situation. The Texaco lawsuit was filed in New York, where Texaco's headquarters was. For 8 years, the Ecuadorians fought to have the right to sue in New York. The Southern District of New York, which is holding Stephen now, said, no, this is not the proper venue. And with Texaco agreeing to abide by whatever decision was achieved there, they won their plea to have the case refiled in Ecuador, saying that New York was not the proper venue, which is very important to remember. Texaco wanted an Ecuador trial. They did not want it in New York. So they won that. And every day people are being
interposed there. Presumably this is because they thought New York juries had a penchant for many zeros on the damages award.
Yes, and that the Ecuadorian system, which at the time was incredibly favorable towards US oil companies, would make this case go away. I mean, remember, this is the same government that allowed them to get away with polluting for decades with no accountability also, right? So their estimation was move the case back to Ecuador and then they could get off scot-free.
Well, they could corrupt the judges.
Or they could corrupt the entire system. Who knows what they could have done. At the time, many of the presidents of Ecuador had been incredibly favorable to these oil companies, but they didn't bank on that shifting when Rafael Correa took over as president of Ecuador and wasn't bending over backwards to the will of the US government and its corporations. So they actually had a fair trial in Ecuador. But again, Chevron, which became the defendant at that point because they acquired Texaco, defended itself, and another 8 years went by while the Ecuadorians sued in Ecuador. And in 2011, almost 10 years to the day, a couple months ago, they won a $9.5 billion judgment. They won their case. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Individuals, indigenous people, farmer communities successfully sued one of the most powerful US corporations and won a $9.5 billion judgment to have their homelands cleaned up and to provide healthcare costs because a wave of cancers had had come through the region and continues to. So this wasn't about them getting rich. This wasn't about them getting money from. This was about getting a clean environment for a crime that the company had admitted to doing. But Chevron vowed that it would never pay, pulled its assets out of Ecuador, and then went back to that same district where I mentioned that Texaco said the case should not be heard, and filed that RICO suit against Stephen Donziger and others, saying that the entire thing was a scheme and a fraud to extort money from them, and they were indeed the victims. And this was a strategy that was employed by Chevron's law firms, Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, called the kill step, to invalidate foreign judgments and protect US corporations from accountability outside of the United States. And what was so diabolical about it is that they filed it preemptively. So they filed it 2 weeks before that Ecuadorian judgment was issued. They found a court, Lewis Kaplan, this federal judge in New York, who would allow a trial to proceed with no evidence of the contamination being permitted in as part of the trial. And he allowed them to put forth a witness who admitted to being paid $2 million in cash and benefits by Chevron, was coached by them for over 50 days, and admitted later that he lied for Chevron in order to get more money from Chevron. So there's no world in which this is a credible witness, but this is the key witness in their RICO case. And so Lewis Kaplan issued a verdict, found Stephen Donziger and the others liable, and that RICO decision has been used ever since 2014 to suppress the rights of people speaking out against Chevron and to try to stop international enforcement of the Ecuadorian judgment. Then, when Stephen Donziger and others continued to work to enforce that judgment in Canada and other places, Chevron struck back again. Even though they'd already won that RICO decision, they went back to Lewis Kaplan, former tobacco industry judge who ran that sham trial, and they told Kaplan to hold Stephen in contempt of court and force him to turn over his computer, his cell phone, his privileged information, because they saw that he was continuing to work to enforce that judgment, which he was lawfully allowed to do, even according to the RICO decision. But they wanted that to stop. So they started targeting the people working with him. And that's when Stephen stood up and said, no, he was not going to abide by those orders, challenge them and appeal them to a higher court. While he appealed them lawfully in that civil proceeding, Lewis Kaplan, that same judge, filed criminal charges against Stephen. And the goal, as I mentioned in 2009, was demonize Donziger. They got his license stripped from him, and now they were trying to literally criminalize him, a man who'd never been even accused of a crime. And so by resisting those orders, Kaplan brought criminal contempt of court charges. But again, and Stephen could talk about this, and it's really mind-blowing. Even though I've talked about this for the last 2 years, every time I say it, it still shocks me. This federal judge went to the prosecutor in New York and asked them to prosecute criminally for contempt of court, and they declined 2 times. So then he used an obscure rule called Rule 42 to appoint his own private corporate law firm to act on behalf of the state. And in a move that is, belies the entire process here and showing how corrupt it is, he picked a law firm that already had ties to Chevron, Sword and Kissel, and they took over prosecution of Stephen Donziger. So you have a law firm with ties to the oil industry, clearly a conflict of interest, prosecuting as if they were federal prosecutors to criminalize someone who's standing up to a federal judge in a civil case. And when Stephen resisted, then Kaplan also picked the judge to oversee this criminal case, who has put him on house arrest, Judge Loretta Preska, the Federalist Society member that you mentioned before in the beginning.
I noticed she was a Federalist Society member, yes.
Yeah, so you've got a Chevron-friendly judge who's picking a Chevron law firm, who picked another judge who's a right-wing Chevron-friendly judge.
By George H.W. Bush, as I understand.
Right. And it's all part of their strategy to have us look away from their admitted crimes in the Amazon and the fact that people every day continue to suffer contamination from what they did over the course of decades, and make this a case about Stephen Donziger and alleged corruption, et cetera. And that's why we're talking about that instead of what Texaco and Chevron did in the Amazon. What's happened, though, from my point of view, and again, Amazon Watch as an organization working in partnership and in solidarity with communities affected by oil companies and affected in the Amazon, we see this as their hubris backfiring, because I've been working on this case for 14 years. There has never been this level of attention since that 2011 judgment was issued. And it's because of their persecuting Stephen that 68 Nobel laureates, so many different, now lawmakers are getting involved. We're talking about it today. Finally, corporate media is starting to cover the story a little bit. This is backfiring against Chevron because everyone's asking, why is this happening? And when you ask why, then you have to look at what they did in the Amazon and the fact that they've never cleaned it up. So it's an incredibly important case for the future of corporate accountability, climate justice, the fossil fuel industry, indigenous rights, and the right to check corporate power and be an advocate, a legal advocate in the United States. And I apologize for taking so long to try to give you an overview, but there are so many elements to this that are important.
Complicated story with as many tributaries as the Amazon. I think
yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I'm going to steal that from you.
Feel free. I'm full of them. And Stephen, here we are. So Stephen's having some difficulties with the internet, which is why he cut his video off. It's not because he's shy and retiring or he's locked up. Well, it is partly that, but because his internet is wavering. So Stephen, you got involved in this case, and this is one of the issues that they're throwing in all of the chaff that comes out, is that you seem to have had, you started off, were you pro bono, paid by the Ecuadorian government, paid by Amazon? What's your?
Well, it's good to be here. And thank you for those who are participating. I used to be a foreign correspondent for United Press International in Managua, Nicaragua, before I made the fateful decision to become a human rights lawyer, which has led ultimately to my house arrest for 2 years in Manhattan. So I just want everyone to know I'm in solidarity being a foreign correspondent in another country. We had many good parties in Managua during the Sandinista era. I'm a little probably older than most of you. I can't see anybody. So I just want to get that out front. Look, this is not a money case, but money plays an important role. And what I mean by that is this: it's a human rights case. You know, all the lawyers working on this are not in it for the money. Although the economic model that has sustained the case for 28 years now is based on money. That is, it's based on the notion that the indigenous peoples of the Amazon, in holding legal claims, actually had an asset class that could be monetized to pay law firms to bring their case in a way that would allow them a somewhat of a level playing field with one of the largest and most powerful companies in the world. And I would submit that one reason Chevron is going crazy about me is because I played a key role in pulling together this new asset class in the human rights world that allowed, you know, significant investment funds to flow in to the indigenous groups that allowed them to succeed in court. So where they once had hope of getting justice, we were able to monetize the hope in a way that allowed them to actually get justice over a period of several years. So when you ask, like, how have I been paid? Like, it's not about the money, but obviously all lawyers and professionals need to sustain themselves. So out of the case budget, I received a stipend over the years that allowed me to live, and I also did other cases. Since then, I'll add that I have been hit with literally the largest fine in United States history, $1 billion+ imposed on me by Judge Kaplan. And he eventually reduced that, but he's imposed millions and millions of dollars of fines and court costs on me that I supposedly owe to Chevron, that have all but bankrupted me. So while I've been deprived of my liberty for almost 2 years, I've had my bank accounts frozen, and I've also been disbarred. I'm not a lawyer. I mean, I'm educated as a lawyer, and I have 30 years of practice as a lawyer, but I'm not a lawyer anymore because they took my law license based on these erroneous findings of Judge Kaplan, based on the false witness testimony by
So who disbarred you precisely?
The Manhattan Bar Grievance Committee. It's a little private group that regulates lawyer discipline, and which is in the United States is regulated at the state level. And each state has their own little group that does it. And it's a self-policing profession. I mean, you can be you could cut hair and you'll have more outside regulation than you would in the legal profession. And I mean that seriously, okay? So these little groups are dominated by the corporate bar, the big corporate law firms. And really probably the most powerful corporate law firm in New York is Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher, which has been paid $1 billion+ by Chevron, employed hundreds of lawyers to target me and demonize me and criminalize me for the last 10 years. And they were the ones, along with Judge Kaplan, who recommended I be disbarred, and I was denied a hearing based on Judge Kaplan's false findings.
They disbarred you without a hearing?
Without a hearing. Well, it's a little more complicated. Basically what happened is they imposed collateral estoppel, meaning they first suspended my law license without a hearing, saying I was a threat to the public order by virtue of winning the judgment, which I took frankly as a form of flattery. Subsequent to that, I demanded a hearing, even though my license was suspended. And they gave me a hearing, but at the hearing, they prevented me from challenging Judge Kaplan's findings. They prevented me from presenting evidence. All I could present was character evidence, that is, prominent people could come in and vouch for my integrity, which I did do. And just based on that, the hearing officer recommended my law license be reinstated. And that so pissed off Chevron and Judge Kaplan that the appellate court, the hearing officer wrote a 45-page decision supporting me. The appellate court in a 1-page summary order overturned him and said I had to be disbarred. So I never got a chance to present evidence, on the findings that are the basis of my disbarment, which is that I bribed a judge in Ecuador, which is false. And it's been rejected by 28 appellate judges in Ecuador and Canada, including the Supreme Courts of both countries. So you basically have a situation, and as foreign correspondents, maybe you can appreciate this more than most American journalists, a lot of whom ignore this story, okay? But you basically have a situation where one low-level U.S. trial judge, Louis Kaplan, out of his Manhattan trial court, okay, like in Latin America, we would call this a court of primera instancia, first level court. I don't know how many people on this call are from Latin America. Can you give me a rough idea?
I can't at the moment, I'm lucky, but
okay, but in any event, he's a low-level trial judge who, for all intents and purposes, ran a non-jury trial against me where he purported to overturn a decision of Ecuador's highest court and Canada's highest court. And it's just preposterous. So when people say, oh, Donziger is a bad guy and he's locked up, it's all framed by Chevron and this judge to essentially destroy the claims, the judgment won fair and square by the indigenous peoples of Ecuador. It's designed to distract public attention and the attention of journalists from what the environmental crimes that Chevron did in Ecuador that Paul described. The deliberate dumping of billions of gallons of cancer-causing waste onto indigenous lands, which is not disputed. It was proved in court in the trial in Ecuador, an 8-year trial. No one disputes it, not even Chevron. But to evade paying the judgment and to sort of save face, they had to invent a foil, and that person is me. And they've literally spent $2-3 billion, used 60 law firms, 2,000 lawyers and investigators and PR people to target and demonize Stephen Donziger. And folks, I work out of my kitchen in my 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I mean, that's my story. In sum, I believe I'm the first corporate political prisoner in the United States. My country goes around to many of your countries and pontificates about how great we are and how you need to do human rights better than you do. Well, excuse me, okay? What's happening to me, I am a human rights violation on US soil. The New York Times has totally ignored this story for 2 years. The lead attorney for the New York Times on press issues, Ted Boutros, works for Chevron at the Gibson Dunn firm and has billed them millions of dollars to attack me. The New York Times has a total conflict of interest. By the way, I didn't come on to talk to journalists to criticize media institutions, but I'm just pointing out.
Feel free.
Yeah, feel free. I'm just pointing out how political this has become. And, I've had journalists fly 4,000 miles from Germany to interview me in my living room. And the New York Times is a 30-minute walk from my house and they won't even show up.
That's well, we've often found that. Some of us are not as impressed with the U.S. court system as the
Well,
U.S. court
that's
system
one of the
is.
reasons I was looking forward to talking to this crowd. I figured you would probably understand it a little better than many U.S. journalists.
But the whole idea of jurisdictions, because the US has always claimed it can override any court anywhere in the world whenever it suits them. I mean, it's
I mean, think about this.
cherry picking.
I mean, on that point, think about this. Think of an Ecuadorian judge had done to the US Supreme Court what Judge Kaplan did to Ecuador Supreme Court. Like, think of an Ecuadorian trial judge held a trial on some case in the US where the Supreme Court had already ruled and determined that the entire case, including the Supreme Court decision, was a product of fraud and attempted to overturn it from a low-level trial court in Quito, Ecuador. Because that's what Kaplan did here to Ecuador. But, you know, because there's such structural racism and colonialism and how people think about Latin America up here, people are like, oh, Judge Kaplan must have gotten it right. You know, he's a US judge. Meantime, there's 28 judges in Ecuador and in Canada where the Ecuadorians have taken the judgment to be enforced against Chevron's assets, who have ruled the judgment as valid. So how the hell can it be that one US trial judge who refused to look at the environmental evidence, who's biased and he was patently racist during the trial, I'll add, anyone observing it can verify that, including Paul Paz.
Yep, I'll verify it.
Okay. How the hell can he have more credibility on this case than the collective wisdom of 28 judges in Ecuador and Canada who actually looked at all the evidence, including the environmental evidence? But
well,
you know,
the other point is
reporting Reuters, and no disrespect to Reuters, but you know, a lot of the legal reporting out of New York acts like Judge Kaplan is the only game in town. Like, that's the case, and it's not the case.
But I mean, the other part, just regardless of the facts, as somebody might misquote, we have you are locked up under house arrest with the electronic bracelets, etc., etc. And is there any avenue, habeas corpus, or any of these? You know, we Brits were supposed to have done this to you Americans, and you revolted about it all. And even then we accepted habeas corpus, the great writ, in the colonial courts against the king. What's happened here?
Well, there's various avenues on paper that are available, and we've availed ourselves of all of them without result. And you know, the big picture from my point of view is the appellate court in New York is extremely right-wing and pro-corporate, influenced by the Federalist Society, and they just don't want to help me. I have criticized Judge Kaplan publicly. I've criticized the judge who locked me up, the judge he appointed illegally, I might add, Judge Preska, publicly. I'm outspoken. I want my freedom, and I don't enjoy criticizing judges. But I determined, along with my lawyers, that the only way I even had a chance of surviving this is to go public as much as I could. Because, and I have developed, I think, or helped develop, along with Paul and others, a huge amount of awareness around the world about the injustice of this and about really the corruption that's taking place here in New York in the court system. 68 Nobel laureates have demanded my release. You know, thousands of lawyers have signed a petition. 37 bar associations have demanded my release. You know, major.
Roger Waters has demanded your release.
He should probably be at the top of the list, right?
He's more famous than any of the others, isn't he?
Sting came by my house. Why am I not out? You know, in all seriousness, Roger, Sting, Danny Glover, Susan Sarandon, you know, people of high profile have stepped up. And by the way, that's important because of their influence and because of their social media presence, and it really does spread awareness, and I appreciate all that they're doing. Anyone who looks at this in an objective way realizes, I think, what is happening. I think the case has become an embarrassment to the United States, an embarrassment to the Biden administration, and an embarrassment to our court system. And I just don't see how our State Department can go around the world trying to lecture China or any other country on human rights when, you know, I mean, obviously we have massive problems with our criminal justice system apart from me, including police racism. But, when you start locking up human rights lawyers, it's a kind of a different animal that we haven't seen before in this country. I am the first corporate political prisoner. This is the first corporate prosecution. As Paul said, and this is a critically important fact, my case, my criminal contempt case, which involves me refusing to turn over my computer to Chevron, was declined for prosecution by the regular prosecutor. And Judge Kaplan appointed a private law firm to prosecute me. It's crazy. We don't prosecute in rule of law countries people privately. We just don't do it. Okay.
I would have thought a lawyer, no matter what the political connection, lawyers should not take kindly to litigants having their computers and data seized.
It's outrageous. I mean, first of all, the order that I turned it over was patently illegal in my view, and I appealed it. So I was appealing the lawfulness of his order, and then he accused me of a crime for not complying with an order, the lawfulness of which I was appealing. That has never happened before in American history to a lawyer until me. And it's really a power grab by Judge Kaplan. I mean, it's like you can't hold the guy accountable. And the appellate court keeps backing him up. So here I am, I'm on day 672 of house arrest without a conviction. I mean, I'm gonna be convicted, by the way, let me be very clear, but it's the trial so biased and unfair, I didn't get a jury. Judge Preska will convict me. It's just a matter of 2-3 more weeks. It's gonna happen, and she probably will try to put me in jail. It's absolutely gonna happen. I will appeal it. We have a great appeal. I hope to win the appeal. I hope to stay out of jail. I hope it doesn't happen. But I'm scared. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, I'm innocent. I've prepared myself psychologically, as well as my wife, Laura, and my 14-year-old son, Matthew, for the fact I might be absent for several months, locked up somewhere. I'm ready to deal with it, but I don't want it to happen. And it's just grossly unfair.
Maybe you should have gone with bear spray down to the Capitol Hill on January the 6th and you'd be out by now.
But it's funny you say that. I love your sense of humor, by the way. Let me just say this, Ian. When the insurrection happened on the Capitol, it was shocking to me that, at least for the first couple of weeks, 95% of those arrested were released on their own recognizance. They had no bond, no ankle bracelet. I mean, people were trying to overthrow the damn US government, committing violent acts to do so. And I did nothing other than refuse to turn my computer over to protect my clients' interests and their privileges. And I get locked up for 2 years with an ankle bracelet and an $800,000 bond, which, by the way, is higher than the bond put on 3 of the 4 cops who murdered George Floyd. Go figure that one.
Well, there are ways to figure it, and it comes out as 0 for justice. We have some questions coming in. Frank Gomez, you mentioned tributaries. What can be done to protect them in Colombia and Venezuela from like Ecuador? This is broadening it back to where we started again. Paul?
Well, to protect them from oil drilling specifically, or protect
I presume so, yes. From abuses such as those in Ecuador. Well,
the situation is very different in all of these countries, in Ecuador, Colombia, and Venezuela, for obvious reasons. Right now, the situation in Colombia is incredibly dire, as bad as it's been, going back to the height of its civil war, with the human rights violations taking place against protesters. Amazon Watch actually works with some indigenous communities in Colombia. That the growing resistance to resource extraction, mining, and oil extraction in Colombia, I think, and throughout the Amazon, will continue to achieve, I think, power in concert with the climate movement by targeting oil companies and the financial backers. Because as we just heard from the International Energy Agency, as we saw at the shareholder meetings of some of the largest oil companies in the world a few weeks ago, the understanding that not only emissions, but drilling and refining of oil needs to be cut back drastically and a complete managed decline. So we can't afford to be drilling for oil in places like the Arctic and the Amazon, first of all, and we can't afford as a community, as a global community, to burn the oil that exists now. So that, along with staunch resistance from indigenous communities, will continue to, I believe, achieve results to protect the Amazon. Now, Venezuela is a different story. We don't actually operate there. I don't know what the status is of the movement there to protect certain areas. Obviously, they depend greatly on oil, as does Ecuador, and it's not going to be an easy fight, basically, in any of these places. But we're seeing a shift in Ecuador specifically during the last election. Even though the indigenous candidate didn't make it to the final round, the movement behind the end of extractives was immensely popular nationally. So the population is shifting as far as their attitude towards extracting and putting the Amazon at risk in order to benefit what ends up being corrupt politicians and oil companies, because they're realizing it doesn't come back to benefit society anyway. It only benefits a small portion. I think we're going to see that throughout the Amazon. Places like Brazil, a whole other ball of wax also, because you have a president who, I mean, insane is one word that comes to mind.
Federalist Society member.
Yeah, I mean, you know, directly assaulting and trying to achieve a genocide of indigenous people. So the whole region is at risk. And to speak really quickly about the Amazon in general, it is at a tipping point. We have reached the ecological tipping point for the entire rainforest. So unless we take drastic measures to keep 80% of it untouched, we will not be able to recover from catastrophic climate change temperature rises because of the importance of the Amazon as a carbon sink and because of the importance of it for our global weather system. So we're at a crisis point. Oil is one battle. And that's just another example of why going up against oil companies like Chevron, those who do it cannot be at risk for jail time because they stand up and push back against this. Climate change battles here in the United States, in Ecuador, and Colombia, anywhere else, are going to come up against the same lawyers, the same law firms, and the same oil companies. And if they've weaponized the system to suppress their rights to fight back, then what chance have we?
There's other questions, but Frank Gomez again from the Latin American foreign, God, I've forgotten the name, Frank, but we'll get it. He's covered foreign affairs from a Latin American procedure for a long time. And he's made the point that Biden, when he was VP, under him, the Joint Chiefs of Staff said the greatest security threat was climate change. So, you know, what is the US government doing? It's sort of clucking when Brazilians cut down trees to make hamburgers and grow cattle and soybeans, but it's condoning the headwaters of the Amazon being polluted with heavy toxic hydrocarbons.
Well, there was just recently a very important successful campaign during the Biden administration's climate summit to prevent them from signing an agreement with Bolsonaro's administration regarding the Amazon. Bolsonaro, while destroying the Amazon actively, was going to the US government asking for millions of dollars in aid to protect the Amazon, while he cut their entire agency that's in charge of its protection by 90%. So activists, indigenous leaders, environmental leaders came together to push the Biden administration not to go forward with that agreement. And it failed. And it failed because of people saying to Biden, you can't stand up on a national stage during your election campaign and say we have to stop the deforestation of the Amazon, which he did twice, and then not follow through when the primary destroyer of it comes to you for money. So I think there is hope for a successful shift in the Biden administration's policy towards Brazil. It's going to take a lot more effort to do it. And we're actually right now asking John Kerry to weigh in on threats that the Munduruku community in Brazil is facing from illegal miners on their land that are backed by the administration. So there's very real threats to the lives of people standing up to defend the rainforest today that the Biden administration can help defend and save the lives of people at risk if they will stand up and take action.
Kathleen Thomas wants to know, I think I did ask the question before, is there anything the Association of the Bar of the City of New York could do to help with legal issues? Because they tend not to reflect the views of the judiciary as far as I can remember.
Well, the answer is, of course, they can help. They don't. look, let me give you my take on that. A lot of lawyers in New York are scared to death of the federal courts. And they have a really hard time getting their arms around the idea that there might be something untoward or corrupt happening in the great, courts of the United States of America. And they just don't want to take the time to either learn it or, they just recoil from it, like
It
reflexive.
did that though, because the Southern District was the stamping ground of Rudy Giuliani, whose acolytes and disciples I see are littered across this case in one form or another.
Oh yeah, the main lawyer, the main Chevron, thank you, the main Chevron lawyer going after me, who's literally billed hundreds of millions of dollars over the years, is Randy Mastro, who was Giuliani's deputy mayor when Giuliani was mayor of New York, and Randy Mastro is still Giuliani's personal lawyer. So this is a Giuliani, Trump, Mastro crowd, funded by funded by big oil. Allied with the Federalist Society, which is funded by the Koch brothers network, and their whole goal, among others, is to basically control the United States government. I mean, every branch, executive, legislative, and now judicial. This country, my apologies, I love my country, but I'll say this, I've been working professionally for 35 years. It's just unbelievable what's happened to this country compared to 35 years ago. I mean, the level of corporate consolidation of power in the United States is just unbelievably strong and getting stronger. My case is a good example. I'm being prosecuted by a corporation. In other words, they tried to get the government to prosecute me 3 times. The government turned them down, so they just did it themselves. And they figured out a judge who would help them by appointing a Chevron law firm. I mean, does that surprise anyone? I mean, this is the United States.
I've just read today that the Economic Revival Act had a specific exception that if you sell king crabs on mail order, you don't have to declare the origin. Who paid the check for that? That's a very specific. Exactly. Somebody has passed a check to somebody to get that one clause in an act, and in no way is that transparent or legal. Aaron Sokol wants to know what we can do about it.
First of all, if you can write about it, come interview me. I'm in New York. We can set up a call, Zoom. I mean, I would encourage people to dig into this. It's really an extraordinary example of a US human rights violation. And I think the more countries and press in other countries that know about it, the better. So I would urge people to write about this. I will make myself available for interviews. I might be going to jail soon. Please do it soon. But I'm a Harvard Law graduate. I was in the same class, by the way, as President Obama. And I just can't believe this is happening. So, also follow me on Twitter. You can get a lot of good information at Donziger or our website, donzigerdefense.com, where you
can put all of these out on the
yeah, you can get a lot of the articles at least. And
Maggie Anderson has come in with an interesting point, because I actually did a lot of work on Shell in the Nigerian Delta, where if you remember, in that case, the opponents were not just jailed, they were killed.
Yeah.
So what are the implications of the inability to pursue cleanup on potential rulings against the Royal Shell from indigenous communities in the Niger Delta, who, thanks to a UK ruling this February, can now sue Shell as a parent company in the UK instead of the Nigerian courts?
Let me say this about that question, and this is my takeaway. There are movements in court systems in the Netherlands, in England, and in some places in Europe, and in Canada, I'll add, that are much more accelerated, much more moving toward where courts need to be on climate issues, on issues of pollution, than what's happening here in our country. I mean, the United States is like backwards compared to Canada, the Netherlands, and England on a lot of these decisions. So, I mean, one example is obviously what's happening to me, but it goes way beyond that. There's all sorts of lawsuits dealing with climate change in America, but because our federal courts are so stacked in favor of the industry and the judges are generally so pro-corporate, you can't get anywhere. And really, it's terrible. It's not a fair system. It's rigged against people who care about climate. So, I want to just point that out. That's my experience. I think it's borne out by just the failure to move on a lot of these cases. Worse, the idea an oil company can use a racketeering civil statute intended to destroy the mafia against groups of environmentalists and lawyers like me and Paul, claiming all of our environmental corporate accountability work is akin to mobster activity, that we're trying to extort them, is a total abuse of power. I mean, you don't see that kind of lawsuit in any other country but the United States. And the fact that judges allow them to even happen, or people like me and Paul have to, find lawyers and defend ourselves. So instead of doing the work we want to do, which is hold the polluter accountable, we have to do the work we don't want to do, which is defend ourselves and our own behavior. So there's some really negative legal trends in the US, which, by the way, in terms of climate change and the environment, which, by the way, I think would make for a really interesting story.
Well, we will work on that as well.
By the way, if you need any other story ideas, just call me up. I know you guys.
always, toujours. Yeah. Simon Locke wants to know what the satellite image of the Amazon will look like in 10 years in a worst and best, I think he's thinking in terms of like the Antarctic, the Greenland ice cap with
we're approaching
Amazon.
We're approaching what is likely to be the worst burning season in history. Last year, it was worse than the year prior. And you may remember in 2019, when the world was kind of shocked into caring finally about the Amazon, when they saw the horrible images of the fires, which had been increased 80% from the years prior. This is arson, right? This is arson because of Bolsonaro and those who back him. As long as he remains in power and as long as those behind him are financing the extraction, those fires will get worse every year and the satellite image will continue to look worse. We don't have much time to push back on that. And I'm grateful that people in Brazil are finally standing up and Bolsonaro's, back on his heels, and hopefully they can get rid of him. But if it doesn't just affect Brazil, it affects all of us. And if we don't push back against that, it will be worse this year. And, actually at Amazon Watch, we just had a meeting this morning. How are we getting prepared for what's likely going to start in end of June, early July? So many indigenous territories. Like if you look at the Amazon and the places where it's not deforested, it's because indigenous communities have protected those territories. The most effective way to stop deforestation and destruction is to advance the rights of indigenous peoples. That's been scientifically proven, which is why we do our work in solidarity with them. So if communities in, for example, southern Ecuador, who've seen the legacy of destruction from Chevron, can stop oil drilling in their territory, that will protect that region, the most biodiverse part of the Amazon. If communities in Brazil who have seen the destruction from big agriculture, from cattle and soy, hydroelectric dams and mining, can have their rights protected to stand up to deforestation and fires, it will save that portion of the rainforest and protect all of our climate. But only if we really stand along with those people who are being threatened. Those stories need to be told, and they can't be told in the context of wildfires, because that's the assumption that many people make. They saw what happened in Australia, they saw what happened in California. They assumed what happened in the Amazon was a tragedy of environmental consequences that was caused by nature, but not at all. Deliberate arson, and that we can stop if we organize.
Mm-hmm. We've had several requests. NHK want to know how to get hold of you and interview you, so we've had we've made the connections.
Me or Paul?
You, I think specifically. I'm not sure. Yes. So. Do you want to put your email up here?
Sure, go ahead, put my email and phone number.
Okay, can you put it up on the panelist thing? Make it easier.
Where do I do it in the?
I'll do it.
Okay, good. No. So, we're eager that the purpose of these things is to make the contacts for you all.
Are most of your members based in Washington?
No, mostly they're New York. So they cover a mixture of politics through the United Nations and because New York's a big center, and media, and also, of course, finance. So, it's all there. It's one of the problems the founding fathers were very clever splitting up the capital this way, so that the media is in New York. It works as well. You know, they know how to play the media markets.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, as I said, I'm on the Upper West Side of New York, and people can come visit me, or we can talk by phone if you're interested.
I'll drop around for a drink. I'm in the Upper West Side. I'll lean out the window and shout to
No,
you.
no. You should definitely come up. I mean, they do allow me to receive visitors, so that is one of the fun things. And we try to have people over as much as possible, so we don't go batshit crazy in our apartment.
Yeah. Does this mean I'll get tailed by Chevron on my way home?
Don't you
They go
want
to the
that?
neighborhood.
That'll be color for your story. I feel as if you want that.
It might mean you get to talk to Roger Waters about writing some of the greatest rock songs
Oh, we
in
can
history.
do that. Hey, I saw the Beatles in the cabin when I was a kid. Roger Waters is good, but you know,
Well,
he's not quite up there.
we need to get Paul and Ringo to visit you, Stephen.
Yeah.
I know. Ian, who do you work for, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I'm a freelance writer. I write for everybody.
Okay.
But you know, I write for financial papers. I write for foreign policy papers, and I've written a lot of books. And I found that being president of the Foreign Press Association takes up so much of my time. I don't get enough time to write anymore.
You know, Stephen mentioned stories. Here's a story that others should take up. There have been many stories over the last several years killed by Chevron's lawyers, from independent journalists and others working on this. It's not just the New York Times that won't write about it. This happened in Canada. This has happened across the United States. Many journalists who I've spoken to who are afraid to even go on the record to talk about what happened. Some of them are at major networks. Someone needs to write a story about their intimidation of the press. What they do is they use Kaplan's RICO verdict, and Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher and lawyers like Ted Boutros, they pick up the phone and they crush stories. And sometimes they threaten journalists, and sometimes they have actually hired people to go after journalists on social media and attack their credibility.
Oh, we've had many cases. We have had the pharmaceutical companies, the chemical companies, Roundup, all of the others. You know, we are well aware of the type of pressures that can go on to journalists.
And how many of those people are also receiving awards as victors, as fighters for the First Amendment, like Ted Boutros? This is a lawyer who gets accolades for his defense of free speech rights while he and his firm are suppressing the rights of journalists. So there's a story there that I think so much.
Me and Ozzy doesn't. We're fairly fervent on this freedom of the press thing, and intimidation by proprietors as well. I mean, I don't know, you know, remember there was a thing about the British journalist who can hope to bribe or twist the British journalist, since seeing what unbribed he do, there's really no occasion to. And it's the same with many press. You go to an editor and they'll kill a story dead, or it'll just get lost in there and it'll never appear and they'll never tell you why, which is one of the reasons why I've stayed freelance all of these years. Because if an editor says no, I'll carry on until I find one that says yes. And I hope to carry on this vein with you all. We are coming up to the end. Any one last question from everybody? You've got the details, you've got the storyline, you can go chasing after our heroes here.
Can I just say, I want to thank you, Ian, and others for organizing this. As I said, I used to do this in Nicaragua. I was a foreign journalist, and I love journalism, and thank you for what you do. And, you know, my apologies for any obstacles you're facing in my country, but you won't face any obstacles if you show up here, I promise. I'd even get a cold beer or glass of wine if you're lucky.
Okay. Do you have any rum? That was my last book, but that's another story.
I'll rum too.
Well, hopefully you'll be out in time to come to our awards sessions soon, since we're reviving, hoping that the lockdown is now over and we can meet in person again.
Yes.
So thank you, Paul. Thank you, thank you, Steve. It's been a vigorous and lively discussion. I'm sorry to everybody if you think I've been editorializing, but I get angry about these things as well. And I think a journalist who pretends to be dispassionate in the face of injustice isn't a journalist, is a stenographer. She's a stenographer.
That's a good quote. Did you make that up?
Yes, feel free.
Very good. I like that.
Paul's already
Got
Paul's
two
already
now from
stolen
me.
one of mine already.
Thank you.
I'm on a roll today. I'm on a roll. Priceless quote. I'll be in the Oxford Book of Quotations next. Thank you very much, everybody.
You cannot keep me down. I won't fall to the ground. I'll struggle on for 10 long years. I'm out the other side crystal clear. I'm made from the same stuff as you, blood and bone through and through. And I don't desire anything at all, and I'm indestructible.